Perhaps will give us a fresh sort of understanding of it. We're looking at this series called "'Tis the Season." That we're looking that Jesus' birth for us Christians is more than simply a historical event, but something that is dynamically changing in the world in which we live. Another movie that you may or may not know. You can guess the movie. What movie is this character from? Anybody know? Princess Bride, well done. And in The Princess Bride, there's a whole lead up to this quote, but the guy called Inigo Montoya, who's that guy, and somebody says the word agile, and he says to that person who says that word, "I do not think that word means what you think it means." And I always think that about Advent. I think that can be said about Advent. I do not think that word Advent means what you think it means. Because so many people, both inside church and outside church, get it wrong. What on earth is this word Advent mean? I don't know about you, but I sometimes cringe around Christmas time because of the facts that they get wrong, and we get wrong. Not just the obvious ones like drummer boys and, all that stuff, but ones like, that Mary and Joseph probably weren't in a stable or a barn. The Bible doesn't really say that. They probably weren't surrounded by talking or non-talking farm animals. There wasn't necessarily three wise men. We don't know how many three wise men. We just told there's three gifts. And so there's all those kinds of things that kind of make me cringe a little bit, but you sort of run over that and think, well, that's okay. That doesn't take away from the meaning of this Advent season. This is a wonderful season that we call Advent, but it essentially means a bunch of things, but essentially it means the word coming. It's more than simply getting ready for Christmas. It simply means, it's from a Latin word called adventus, which means coming. And the coming that we celebrate at Advent isn't Jesus' first arrival at Bethlehem alone, but we also celebrate it in the context of another Advent, another coming. The first advent of Jesus Christ inaugurates this reconciliation between God and man and woman, a process in which we now participate. We call it salvation, where God is and us are reconciled. And so the first coming was that Jesus, this first advent, that he would come and inaugurate that. The second advent is about consummation. It's about something to anticipate. So Advent for us Christians both has a participation thing and an anticipation. Now, I grew up in churches when I was a kid that they only ever seemed to talk about the second coming of Jesus, and it scared the life out of you. We had preachers on Sunday nights particularly, I might have told you this, and they would come and they would preach and warn you about getting hit by buses at the end of the service, and where would you go, up or down, would it be hot or cold, all of that stuff. It made me very wary of buses, but the second coming of Jesus was a very focused thing, and really is an important part of our theology and the whole counsel of God. So Advent is a very important thing, both in its participation and its anticipation. And so we're focusing this Advent season on how worship is expressed in that context and what worship actually looks like for us. Last week we looked at this sense of joy, joy that goes beyond our happiness, that happenings go up and down and in and out, but joy is something that is much deeper. And we looked at this definition of worship, that worship really is responding to God for who God is and what God has done for you. And we looked at the book of Romans where Paul the Apostle had written, in view of God's mercy, let us offer ourselves, our bodies, as living sacrifices. In other words, let us give all of our lives to this thing that is worthy above all other things. That the weight of God's glory outweighs the weight of all of the other stuff in our lives. But when we think about that word worship, often we don't think of that definition. We think of stages and guitars and drums and organs and singers and all that kind of stuff, which is part of worship, but it's really the expression of worship rather than the essence of worship. Worship may for you mean attending church. You may have decided to come to worship today, and there is a part of that is right, and it's a good habit to get into and a bad habit to get out of. But the big question is, for us, if we're looking at worship as being a response for what God has done and who God is, then the big question for us and me and you is, who do we see God to be? And what do we think he has done? Because the answer to those two questions will really inform and really change the way you worship. So let's dive into a familiar story from the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that after the event, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men, not 3, not 10, could be 3, from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. There's that word, worship him. We've come to worship him. Now, the word magi, or wise men, the word magi is from a Greek word they get magos, which means magic, and many believed, and there's been a lot of speculation about who these people were, but many believed that they were like ancient priests who would use the constellations and the patterns of the sky to gain wisdom and guidance for their lives. Can you imagine that there was once a time in human history when people looked to the constellation of the stars for guidance in their lives? Can you imagine? Imagine that. 2,000 years later, and we're still carrying on with that nonsense. The text says that they were from the east. They were from the Arabian Peninsula, we think. But the most important detail is that they were coming to Jerusalem. They were coming in as foreigners, as outsiders, as pagans, seeking this child, seeking an entirely different king with which they would have been familiar. Now, it's interesting that there was a king in place in Judea, and that he is named in this passage. He is called Herod the King. Now, Herod the King also was known as Herod the Great. Have a wild stab at who gave him his nickname. Herod. Herod the Great. Alexander the Great. Ian the Average. You know, it's all that kind of, that's kind of a moniker you give to yourself. I don't know how many of you really wanted a nickname when you were kids. Like a good nickname, you know, like TJ, or I don't know, something that was sort of cool, you know. My name's more of a grunt than anything else, like Ian. There's not a lot you can do with that. But I desperately wanted a nickname, you know, like Flash. Although in this context that might be a bit dangerous. But Herod the King was Herod the Great. So there was a king in Jerusalem. It was just that they were looking for another king. And you know what it is through human history? Incumbent kings get very nervous about incoming kings. You notice that? It's all a bit Games of Thrones-y, that kind of stuff. That was King Herod. Herod, when he heard the news that they were there, brought his teachers of the law and his priests together, and he asked the question, and this is an interesting question. He said, where is the so-called king of the Jews to this child who is to be born? And they searched the scriptures, these wise men, and the Old Testament, book of Micah, had already said that out of you, O Bethlehem, will come the one who will rule over Israel. And Herod realised Bethlehem, that's 8 kilometres away. That's from here to Lanyon, roughly. And Herod said something interesting to these wise men. He said, wise men, you go and find this child and worship him. And when you find him, come back and tell me where he is so that I may worship him too. Now, we all know, in retrospect, that wasn't Herod the Great's agenda. He didn't want to worship him. Turns out that false worship, or even under the canopy of worship, can actually be used for very evil things. Our worship should always glorify and magnify God, not ourselves. Well, the story goes on that after they had heard the king, they went on the way, and the star that they had seen rose ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. And the text goes on and says, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshipped him. And they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. The text actually says that they not only were overjoyed, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. They rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Now remember the context. They don't know this God. Never read much more than probably a copy of the Old Testament or whatever they've done, but they came to worship. But the other interesting thing for that is that their worship led them to give. They bowed down to worship and they brought gifts. You see, those two things are intrinsically linked through the Scriptures, Old and New Testament. Worship and giving. Giving and worship. Now, I'm not talking about cash. I'm not talking about money alone. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about the sense of giving of ourselves. They bowed down and worshipped, and they brought these rather strange gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I may have told you the story of a professor, Ken Robinson, who has he had a little boy at that stage. He was 6, and he was in a play, nativity play. I love stories where nativity plays go wrong. I love all that. But he and 2 of his friends, that's not them, that's just a picture on Google search, but 3 6-year-old boys were supposed to play the 3 wise men. And they were a bit nervous about all that, and their job was to walk up to Mary and Joseph, who were another couple of 6-year-olds, and present them with the gifts and to step back and to say, I bring you, and whatever gift they had. And the first kid walks up, a bit nervous, but he does a pretty good job because he's well trained. His mother's in the 3rd row mouthing it to him, and she goes up and he puts the gold down and he says, I bring you gold. And then he steps back and the mother's delirious and the camera's going and all that sort of stuff. The next kid comes along and he's to put down myrrh. And he comes along and says, I give you myrrh. And everybody's delighted and somewhat relieved that he hasn't stuffed it up. But this 3rd kid looks kind of confused as he's waiting with his gift. And he walks up and he says, Frank sent this. Nativity scenes that go wrong. These gifts were very, very important. They were important in the sense that they were very symbolic as well as very precious. But their giving and their worship were intertwined. Frankincense was a kind of an ancient spice that was often used to relieve pain and sort of aid digestion problems. I got it done with some of that last Sunday afternoon. Myrrh was like a precious oil, and it was a medicinal oil that was used to heal wounds. And it almost functioned like an antiseptic. It was used to embalm bodies, which later would obviously be used to embalm Jesus' body. Many scholars actually believe that frankincense and myrrh in the day were worth more than gold. Somebody told me in Woolies, you know, the most expensive thing per weight in Woolies isn't chocolate, although at the moment, but the most expensive thing per weight is saffron. You know those little vials of saffron? And by weight, that is the most expensive thing in that shop. That's free information. You take that where you like. They bowed down to worship and they brought gifts. But here's the thing. They bowed down and they brought gifts. But they did it out of being overjoyed. They did it from a sense of worship, not a sense of duty. They worship God for who He is and what He has done. In the Bible, worship always involves giving. All the way back to the beginning, Cain and Abel and the Israelites and sacrifices and tabernacles and temples and all that system was to get people into the habit of aligning their worship with giving. And I'm not just talking about cash. I'm talking about the spirit with which we live. This remained even true in the early church. They would pass a collection plate and they would pool their resources and provide for the poor, or they would plant new churches. Worship always involved giving. It always involved a response. It always responded, or invoked a response in the one who was giving. So worship is responding to God for who He is and what He has done for us. And if you want to personalise that, worship for you and for me is responding to God for who God is and what He has done for me and for you. And again, I don't want you to leave this place, particularly it's your first Sunday, and say all they talk about there is giving. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking more about than simply the money that we give to cooperative budgets and all that sort of stuff. I'm talking about the posture of our lives. And the posture of our lives is towards that sense of gratitude to God, that we too are exceedingly glad and full of joy because of what God has done for us. And because he has done what he has done for us, that we're able then to know what that means in terms of the lives that we lead. Worship always involves giving. And these magi brought these gifts because they discovered a different kind of God. In the ancient Near East, all around Israel, people believed very much in different kinds of gods. They called them the gods. And people believed the gods were not like the God that we serve, but the gods were easily angered. They were kind of irritable, a bit like your uncle at Christmas afternoon, or like me. That the gods were difficult to appease. They were never ever satisfied with you. They certainly didn't love you, so people would bring offerings, or gross and violent offerings often, and sometimes just to see if they could basically get something from the gods, to get fertility or rain or whatever it might be. That's why the prosperity gospel, that God becomes a transactional God, is a very dangerous road to go down. They would bring their gifts to appease the gods so the gods would do something for them. There is still a historian called John Walton, not the guy from the Waltons, but he wrote this book, and it's a very interesting book about Genesis chapter 1, the lost world of Genesis 1. And he said this, he described people's posture towards the gods. He said, in those days, the gods in the ancient world were not the object of enthusiastic pursuit. The people sought the gods for protection and assistance, not for relationship. And the difference, I guess, for me, between religion and faith is that word relationship. That a relationship with God is possible because he initiated this first advent, this coming of his Son, so that we might know who he is and what he is like. We couldn't know the gods, we couldn't love the gods. These gods didn't certainly love us. Now, we think, well, back then they were kind of primitive and non-scientific, and but you think of the gods people have today. Commercialism, materialism, sport, whatever it might be. That these things are set way too high in people's lives. And then people try to have a relationship with them. But that was the norm in every culture in the ancient world, except for one. Have a wild guess who they were called. They were called the people of Israel. A nation of former slaves and exiles called Israel claimed that they had this one God and we could have a relationship with him, and his name was Yahweh. And Yahweh had no needs, and he was entirely sufficient within himself. He was not easily angered or irritated. He was not to be bribed or bought out. He was not demanding or, in fact, impatient. In fact, they understood his primary function was to be their provider. They even gave him a name, Jehovah Jireh. Every time I hear those words together, I want to go clap because we were all brought up in church that in the first book of there's a song called Jehovah Jireh. But Jehovah Jireh means simply my provider. And so they had a relationship with God that he would be their provider, that he would give them the earth to inhabit and enjoy. He would give them relationships with each other to enjoy. He would give them his presence so that they would not feel or be alone. They bowed down and worshipped, and they brought their gifts. The first thing results in the second thing. So what do we learn from the kind of nature of these wise men's gifts? Not just in what they symbolize or mean, but what about their giving can we learn? Well, the first thing is that they gave intentionally. They made a decision to give. Somewhere along the line, I don't know how many there were, but someone made the decision that we're going to go and see this new king born. We better intentionally take some gifts. Now, it's not like bringing over a box of roses when you're going out for dinner, although that's a good habit if you're coming to my place. But they gave intentionally. So they made a decision to give. And sometimes we kind of think faith and religion, not faith, but faith and relationship with God is this passive thing. Well, any relationship's not a passive thing. Anybody married? It's not it's not a passive thing. You have to work at it, don't you? Even in the best of relationship, you have to work at it. Not just in marriage, but friendship, church. It doesn't all just happen. The Bible tells us to make every effort to maintain the bonds of peace. We've got to make the effort. We've got to call out bad behaviour. We've got to set some boundaries. We've got to make sure that all of us are getting all of us rather than some. To be a giver, Jehovah Jireh, God has provided that, so they gave intentionally. They travelled thousands of kilometres to give these gifts. It was not an emotional response that they feel pressured to give. The reason they gave intentionally, and we do, is not because they would otherwise feel guilty or bad if they didn't. I have this weird thing that sometimes on Sunday afternoons I bump into some of you who haven't come to church on a Sunday morning. You know who you are. And and I love the interaction because there's this guilt. It's usually in Bunnings. In fact, some Sundays we could have a service in Bunnings, couldn't we? Sunday after, I get it. Not everybody needs to come to church every Sunday. I get it. Okay? Sometimes I don't want to come. But I'm the pastor and I've got to, but there's this guilt, this sense of if I don't, somebody's going to be angry at me. Well, no. But if you don't come for 6 months, you're always going to feel like an outsider. It's always going to be a new thing. What's that guy's name? Where do I sit? How do we do that weird communion thing? How does it all work? I don't feel part of this. Well, maybe you need to intentionally become more part of it. That's what I'm saying. It's the same with what we shove in our faces. The same as how we love each other. We need to be intentional. We give intentionally because we believe a life of generosity and giving is a better way to live. A life of holding and clutching and keeping and counting is not a good way to live. Your heart becomes small and calcified, and the Bible uses a great word for this. It perishes. Perishing is like putting a banana on the table and walking past it for 30 days and looking at it each day, and you can't see it immediately, but it slowly, bit by bit, just perishes and you throw it out. Well, God so loved the world that he gave, so that the world should not perish. So don't perish. Intentionally be a person whose posture is towards giving. And the best way to do that is to start giving. Not your life savings, not all of your time, but just find a place where you can start to give of yourself in some way. The Apostle Paul wrote to a young pastor called Timothy, and he said, command those who are rich, that's us folks, in this present world, that's us, not to be arrogant and not to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything, I love these 3 words, for our enjoyment. Who would have known? Paul's not a Baptist, is he? For our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lap up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of a life that is truly life. I mean, if I had to get another tattoo, that'd be the one, Don't cling too tightly to what you can't keep, because it's not yours anyway. And that includes your children. They're not yours. You're a steward of your children. You're not an owner. So don't hold them too close in a bad sense, because part of our job is to release them into this world as functioning people and adults. God so loved the world that he gave. The primary action of God of Israel is giving, providing. On Christmas we discover that God gave the one thing that God only had one of. And that was his son. And by the way, giving is not measured by the amount that you give. Jesus was once at a gathering of religious people, and he saw people coming out and giving their offerings, and many of them were very wealthy. But he saw this widow, and she gave 2 copper coins, so the scripture says, and which would amount to just a few cents in our day. And he looked at his own disciples and said, she gave more. She gave out of the extravagance of her heart, not the size of her wallet. So it's not about money. Extravagance is not about the worth of the gift, but the cost of the gift. They gave intentionally. Here's the second thing. 2 more and we'll get there. They gave together. I don't know if you ever noticed that. However many there was more than one. Wise men, plural, could have been 2 of them, but they gave together. Helen Keller once said, alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much. And in church life, that's exactly right. What we can do together is amazingly more than what we can do alone. And we do a whole bunch of stuff together that we could not do alone. And you can read updates and stories and stuff like that of how this actually plays out in our life. They're just some things that we do. If you're new to our church, don't think that we just gather on Sunday and go home and that's it for the week. We do a whole bunch of stuff, but it's out of the spirit of giving. So I ministry to kids and brigades and cap money and online stuff and Operation Christmas Child and the op shop and the missionaries we support and the gym and the worship team and all that other stuff happens in our life. Now, over the last 18 months or so, we've had to really try to figure out what we can do and what we're not allowed to do. But it's all with this idea that our relationship up with God enables us to have a relationship together, and therefore that then expresses itself out. They gave together, and we can do so much more together. In fact, you're sitting in the evidence of what we can do together. This physical building, this centre, is what we can do together. And the last thing is that they gave joyfully. They didn't come with furrowed brows and frustration. They couldn't wait to bring their gifts, to release them. The Apostle Paul once said that each of you, not some of you, each of you should give what you have decided where? In your bank balance to give. No, each of you should give what you've decided in your heart. That's a very important distinction, isn't it? Not reluctantly, nor under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. There's nothing worse than an uncheerful, is that a word? Uncheerful giver, or a giver who is devoid of any cheer. Here, have that. Well, I'd rather not have that, thanks. Worship is a response to God for what He has done and who He is. The question for us is this: what will our response to Him be? What have you already or will decide in your heart to give? Again, I'm not talking about the offering, I'm talking about in the world in which you live. Is it your time, your effort, your priorities, your care, your forgiveness? Whatever it is that you have to give, it's a great time to give it. The Apostle Paul said, what then shall we say in response to all these things? Well, if God is for us, then who can stand against us?